Well, let's get started then. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jonathan Whiting, and I'm a data scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing the new offshore wind metadata on Tethys. So today, we're going to go over a quick takeaway. We're going to walk through some introductions, go over some challenges and opportunities around collection of environmental monitoring. We're also going to introduce the offshore wind metadata, give you an update on our progress, give you a live demonstration of it, and then have a quick conversation about data, because that's always fun. And then we're going to go into some next steps and how you can get involved or help out. So really quick upfront, what we're essentially doing is we're launching a new catalog of environmental monitoring information at offshore wind farms around the world. You can access it at the following link or the QR code, which we will scatter throughout the presentation. You can also, if you're already familiar with Tethys, you can find it under the content menu on Tethys. Hopefully most people here, I'm going to start with a few quick introductions in case you're unfamiliar with this, background information. So Tethys is the database that we manage. It's a free database with documents on the environmental effects of wind and marine energy. It contains almost 9,000 documents tagged by environmental stressors and receptors. So you can kind of find whatever you're looking for easily or find other stuff within a similar category. It also hosts a number of other resources, an events calendar, a biweekly newsletter, webinars, and more. The website is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, and it's implemented by PNNL. Tethys also hosts a bunch of content from the International Energy Agency's WREN task, which is an international working group on the high-level environmental effects of wind energy. WREN produces a lot of things, short science summaries, which are real brief, publicly, like high-level information with links to more documents. We've produced a bunch of free webinars and several online tools, such as the recent wind monitoring and mitigation technologies tool that we launched last year. The metadata forms that we're talking about today were developed in partnership with WREN, and they are hosted on Tethys. So there's your backdrop. So why do we create this resource? Outside of a few exceptions, finding monitoring reports and monitoring data for offshore wind farms is really quite challenging. Many monitoring reports might be posted online for a couple of years, but often get removed with time, or perhaps they're reorganizing the website, or the company gets acquired. Those reports are eventually become very difficult to find. Monitoring methods and outcomes are also often buried in these reports, so it's very difficult to access them in aggregate. You have to dig into each report independently, so we've already done that work for you. I've also seen a trend where environmental data is often stored within larger oceanographic or habitat-based data systems. So data for a single offshore wind farm might be distributed among multiple systems. Now, there are some really great efforts to consolidate or federate these offshore wind data to make them discoverable. And in some countries, this is being done at the national level by the government. In other cases, you have progressive wind energy developers that are leading these efforts. But I'll kind of pause there. I will talk quite a bit more about data in a bit, but just that's kind of the context that we're working in. And now the opportunity here is that both WREN and Tethys are well known in the international wind and wildlife community. So there's a good reputation to build off of. And the main function of Tethys is to catalog documents. So we hoped that this would actually help us to locate many of those valuable monitoring reports for the purposes of archival. And Tethys has hosted similar metadata forms for wave and tidal energy projects for almost 11 years now. So we had a really nice template on which to build these forms. The approach is pretty simple. Basically, we're aggregating a bunch of data and pulling it out of reports and things of that nature. The hope is that the impact of the simple approach is significant. One hope for the metadata is that the US is just beginning their offshore wind development. So we're hoping that they can learn from 20 years of experience around the world. So What are metadata? The term itself is often used to describe attributes and characteristics of data, things like location of data or calibration details. We're using it slightly differently, but with the same general idea. Essentially, the whole goal is to describe the context around the environmental monitoring. So that might be describing the studies, but it's also describing the wind farm, offshore wind farm itself. And we also are providing it in a similar format so that it can be compared or aggregated internationally from one wind farm to the next. Each wind farm has a description. Each metadata has a description that details some key events and licensing milestones on the development timeline. And then we describe the physical characteristics such as location and water depth, and along with some project technical details such as describing the turbines and the export cables. All this information is important to understanding the environmental effects. Now, kind of the important part of the meat, you could say, of this is that, and you'll see this in the demo, is that there are tables down below that summarize the environmental monitoring efforts done at the wind farm. And these are divided into the baseline, the construction and operations, and the decommissioning activities. Where possible, we are trying to link to data sets and monitoring reports. Now, the format for these forums has been reviewed by the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, and WREN members. Information was collected by P&L researchers from public information. What they're mostly doing is extracting the information from environmental impact assessments and monitoring reports, and that information was then sent to project developers for review, which is something that we intend to do on an annual basis so the information stays up to date. So far, we've collected information for an initial 20 offshore wind farms. These initial 20 are a little bit biased towards early and planned wind farms in the United States, partly because they're the ones funding it. But we did try to seek a distribution of wind farms from different countries as well, kind of prioritizing those that were unique as far as being larger in size or being early floating wind deployments, or perhaps those that have undergone some decommissioning. We intend to increase this catalog, and it's probably going to increase in the next year primarily into the international realm, and eventually have full coverage of wind farms around the world, which may take a couple of years because it is a large undertaking. All right, so with that, we're going to jump over to a browser and give you a demo of the resource. So here's Tethys. If you're not familiar, you can find the metadata right here, right above it. You can find that wave and title metadata that I had mentioned. But basically, the main page here is a simple table. It is sortable and searchable and filterable. If you're interested in projects in a specific country, for example, or you want to look at ones that are planned and up and coming, you can do that. Clicking on one of the titles down here will take you to more information about the wind farm. This first example is the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind, or CVOW project. It is the second commercial installment in the United States and the first in federal waters. It had an initial deployment of 2 6-megawatt turbines installed 43 kilometers off the state of Virginia. The second phase of the project will expand it to 176 turbines for a total generation capacity of 2.6 gigawatts. So it's going to be a very large project once it's completed, and they're kind of just kicking off into that. They're soon to kick off the next construction on that second phase. So you can just scrolling through here, you can see kind of the description. You can see some highlights in terms of licensing and the project timeline, which you can then see it's 10 years since the initial lease agreement. So it's undergone quite a bit of work getting to where it is now. You will, scrolling down a little bit, you can see some environmental reports and papers. These are, in this case, divided between the pilot phase and the commercial phase to distinguish, because they are doing different monitoring at the different phases. You have all the information up here, such as who's doing it. This is by Dominion Energy. We do have a point of contact. I will note all this information here is public. The one thing that you do have to log in order to see is the email address, and that's just to protect the person who's being listed here. We have a bunch of technical information and characterizations for the project itself, and off here on the side. And then scrolling down a little bit, here we're getting to these tables that I alluded to. So this first table is all the extensive baseline assessment monitoring that was done. A lot of this was done as part of a larger regional study called RODEO, which was led by BOEM, stands for Real-Time Opportunity for Deployment and Environmental Operations. And basically they took a couple of the early planned wind farms and did a regional-wide assessment at these locations. So it includes things such as passive acoustic monitoring for bats and marine mammals, has bird tagging, some sonar studies, and more. You will notice that each of these studies has a brief description. We summarize the results, very, very small, quick summary. There's a link to publications, which are usually where that monitoring is detailed. And then there are links to data sets. So just to give you an example of one of those, you can jump over here. And this is taking us to the MoveBank website, which is really quite a nice website. It involves animal tracking data, and it's as simple as you go here. It's Creative Commons, so it's publicly available. You just click download data, agree to something, and you can download in whatever form you want. It could be a shapefile or a CSV or something like that. So cool website. That's kind of what we're hoping for, links like that where people can very quickly and easily access the data. Yeah, so that's a great example. Now let me jump back up. I'm going to show off another metadata project. So this is another fun one. This example here is the Vindeby offshore wind farm, which is unique because it was the first commercial offshore wind farm in the world. It was installed back in 1991 and then was later decommissioned in 2017. So it has unique decommissioning monitoring. The wind farm consisted of 11 450 kilowatt turbines for a total capacity of 5 megawatts, which you might recognize as less overall capacity than a single wind turbine by today's standards. The water depths are around 2 to 5 meters, so it was really quite shallow. It's pretty near to the coast as well. As the first offshore wind farm, it did probably undergo a fair amount of environmental monitoring. Unfortunately, most of that would have been in 1990s timeframe, kind of prior to digitization of reports. And so we've actually struggled to find a lot of those really early reports. And about the earliest we get is to about 2000. Early 2000s. But what I personally think is kind of interesting here is a lot of the monitoring that's being done here are things of operational wind turbine noise and fish attraction to EMF and things that we aren't necessarily monitoring for a ton these days. And so, but this was, the first wind farm they were characterizing a lot of this information. So it's very interesting. And then as far as decommissioning, they took videos to observe fish displacement and habitat change. And they also took some sediment sampling to observe changes in the benthic habitat kind of before and after the removal of these turbines. So that was interesting to dig into. I will note that there's a lot of in this case, we weren't really able to find any data. Most of this information is purely in monitoring reports. We are still trying to see if that data is available anywhere. One thing I forgot to mention before too as well is some of these details on wind farms are hyperlinked. Basically, you can click on one of them and you can find a little bit more information about what that entails. For example, in this case, why someone would bury a subsea floor cable. You also have a list of all the offshore wind farms around the world that have used it. And in this case, you even have all the wave and tidal energy devices that use it, sometimes if there's terms that are similar between the two metadata efforts. So that's a cool resource that kind of lets you view it in kind of a different slice. So for the sake of time, I'm going to jump back to our presentation here. Wanted to kind of take a little side tangent and talk about data a little bit. So for absolute clarity, we are not in this effort, we are not archiving actual data on Tethys. We're effectively linking to wherever it is publicly hosted at different locations. But it does kind of highlight a big focus on locating and increasing accessibility to environmental data. And this is a topic that it seems like everyone is talking about. My colleague and I were both in Croatia for CWW, the Conference on Wind Energy and Wildlife Impacts last month. And at the end of the conference, they kind of asked all the participants, like, what was missing from this conference? What do you want to talk more about? And you can see from that word cloud down at the bottom, the biggest thing was data sharing. People want to talk about it. We've also tracked nearly a dozen reports from recent years that are all advocating for data sharing in the wind industry. And we have seen some very positive trends, like Ørsted signing an agreement with the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, to share physical and biological data. And even just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. BOEM and BSEE, which is Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, they're kind of sister agencies for the U.S. They just a couple of weeks ago released guidance to standardize visual and geospatial, visual and digital geospatial data. So it's good to see efforts like that coming out. But you will notice that a lot of, as you look through the metadata forms, you'll see a lot of no data publicly available. Part of this is really just that data sharing is a really complex topic. Actually stole this or borrowed this iceberg graphic from a colleague at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And I think it kind of highlights the challenges a lot. People often see the technical challenges with data sharing, things like a lack of data standards, or how do you handle proprietary data formats, or how do you do interoperability, or how do you get good quality control of the data? There's a lot of technical challenges up front, and people see that, but below the surface, it's a much larger issue. Things around organizational, financial, and cultural challenges that make it difficult to do open data sharing. Some of these, as just a few examples off the top of my head, are trying to, company maybe trying to gain compensation for the collected data. It might be fear of litigation if they put this data out there, or it could be concerns about the misinterpretation of that data, or perhaps just the cost of maintaining or hosting data indefinitely, right? These are just a couple of examples of what is a lot of challenges around data sharing. And so it definitely warrants a lot further questions. One other thing I want to highlight is just because data is online doesn't mean it can be found. So discoverability is a really important aspect of that. And many governments are just seeking to archive the data, but not necessarily to have it shared publicly. And that discoverability piece is sometimes missing. So we try to push for that a lot. And hopefully the metadata can do that in cases where the data is a little bit buried. You will also notice that the metadata forms do differentiate between monitoring reports and data. Some governments who mandate data to be made available, sometimes this is interpreted as you can show the data results in a report, and that is effectively sharing the data. But I want to make the case that there's a lot more value in sharing raw data. And before you get too scared by this, I don't mean stuff that has not been quality controlled or vetted. That is important, but it does mean that by raw data, it means that you can take that data, it's in a format that it can be analyzed in new and unforeseen ways. So as a fun, positive example of this, NOAA several years ago released raw radar data to the public. And one research group used this to produce detailed bird migration data, and another research group created more accurate forecast models from this. And so, it was kind of application of the data that they weren't foreseeing, right? You might have foreseen, okay, they might improve the forecast models, but actually creating these migration data from the radar was kind of unexpected. And so by sharing it, it went in positive new ways, and you may not know the question that's even being asked. So raw data has a lot of utility. Within environmental data around wind energy, I'm particularly interested in trying to understand more population level impacts. A lot of this is being looked at just within the footprint of a wind farm, but that's not how animals see it. And so it's hard to understand the larger regional or population level impacts unless you can kind of aggregate data from all these different wind farms. So all this to say, sorry, I went off on a little bit of a soapbox there, but we are definitely talking and thinking a lot about data sharing and what it would entail, and we're open to discussing more and trying to understand some international perspectives. So back to the metadata. what are our next steps? So we are actively still working to add more offshore wind metadata, and that's going to just keep getting slowly added onto the resource. So you might check back in a couple months and you might find, another 5 to 10 project sites added to it. Our goal is to attempt these annual updates with project developers. So we're finding a good point of contact is pretty important to that. And then the metadata also highlighted the need for better data sharing architectures. Within the US, our team is working on collaborating and exploring options around adapting an existing database for offshore wind data in the US. I know a lot of other countries are also kind of at a critical point where they're creating interesting architectures, and so having some international collaboration on that would be really helpful. And finally, we could really use your help. I really would encourage you to explore the resource on Tethys. We welcome any feedback on missing content, or if you think the format could use some changes, we're happy to hear you out. At the same time, we are trying to establish points of contacts with developers. I mentioned that's one of the hardest things to get. So if you are responsible for or can speak authoritatively about environmental monitoring for wind farm, I would love to connect with you. Or if you know the right person, I would love an introduction. Locating data sets has also been the other really challenging element to this. So we would love to hear more about databases in your specific country. We have decent visual idea of what's going on in the US, but it would, maybe there's new efforts that we haven't heard about too. So would love to hear more about that. And finally, we've mostly so far been the ones to fill out these draft forms, and but we do welcome direct input from the community. So we do have like a simple Word document that you can find at the top of the metadata page that you can download, you can fill out, and you can send to us, and it fills out all the fields for the form, or even just sending us some any monitoring reports or data or points of contact for a new wind farm that we don't have. We'll probably bump it up in priority to the top of the list because we have a head start through all the more difficult stuff. So please do reach out to us if you have any of that information. All right, so in closing, I would like to thank this wonderful team of researchers who have contributed to this work. It really has been a team effort. And I would also like to give a shameless plug to subscribe to the biweekly Tethys Blast newsletter, where you can keep updated on new publications, events, and opportunities around wind and marine energy. And please do reach out if you want to have more discussion about the metadata effort. We would love to follow up with your team and answer any questions. Thank you. Haley, are you there?
Yeah, I'm just checking if we have any questions.
Great. Yeah, please do send in questions if you have any. You guys are letting me get off easy here.
All right, we've got a few questions. Are there requirements in the US for developers to submit their environmental data into data archive centers for legacy storage? In the Crown Estate Scotland are directing developers to input data into Marine Data Exchange.
Yeah, we have a similar setup in the US. Most of that is coming through the lease agreement. So it's being enacted by BOEM, who leases the seabed. And as part of that lease agreement, developers are required to share data publicly within 3 years after the start of data collection. So there's some time for them to kind of start beginning to process the data and kind of figure things out. But they are, but yeah, so there is a process in place. Now, there are some caveats to it. If that data is viewed as having commercial, having some sort of a commercial value to it, then they might possibly be able to get at, like not share it, or if it has some competitive advantage. So there's a possibility they might not have to share it, but that's still kind of being decided by the lawyers right now in terms of like what necessarily that entails. And so, and it's been interesting because we've heard from certainly at CWW conference, we heard from another couple of developers that you know, kind of how it works in some of the different countries, and it's interesting to see kind of a span of experiences across different countries. Not all are taking the same approach, and we even learned just the other day that in Germany it's actually quite the opposite, where regulators or the government appears, I haven't validated this, but allegedly the government is basically saying you should not share, you're not allowed to share data until 5 years after collection, because they're worried about, you know, concerns and basically, you know, developers being damaged by you know, misrepresentation of data. I don't know what experience happened there to lead to that, but yeah, that was yeah, interesting to hear.
Right, thanks, Jonathan. So your next question is, do you need marine mammal data?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Do you need marine mammal data?
Do I need it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, marine mammal data is really valuable. I think that's certainly being more familiar with the U.S. experience along the East Coast. North Atlantic right whales are probably one of the biggest concerns that they're looking at. And so if there's tracking data for marine mammals, if there's any displacement information, I think any of that would be really valuable. Usually the form that it would take is probably things like marine mammal, like sea tags or something like that. Although you usually can't do that to threatened or endangered animals. Usually there's, depending on the country, usually you can't interact with them in many ways, but it might be like hydrophone data where you're trying to find clicks, or it could be some satellite tracking of whale pods. Marine mammal data is great, yeah.
All right, your next question is, this is an amazing effort. Could it potentially be a springboard for regional standardization of monitoring methods across projects? For example, the recommendations in the NYSERDA regional synthesis document that was just released.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, we're obviously not directly advocating for, it's a big undertaking for standardization through this, but we are, I think that could certainly be an outcome, is that what we are providing is a bunch of links to and kind of showcasing like what is the monitoring that's being done at various wind farms, and you know, if we can link to the data, how is it being presented, where is it working well, where is it not, and so the thing is, you might be able to infer that from looking at this information might be able to help inform some of the data standardization. So yeah, we certainly hope that could be an outcome of something like this, but we're not directly advocating for that ourselves yet. But also one thing to say is, like, we may not want, like, the standardization of a specific data type is really good, but we may not want to have each wind farm be monitoring the same things, right? That's not what we're looking for, because each site is very different. It's unique. It has different environmental concerns, and so it will have different environmental monitoring. You know, it's not going to do away with the need to get that baseline assessment, kind of figure out what's at your site and what might you need to mitigate for or monitor for. And so all that's still going to exist, but data standardization, so you can kind of compare, or you can look across a region and see things, is huge. So yeah, hopefully we're moving in that direction.
All right, and then I think our last question before we wrap up: will details on mitigation measures required at specific wind farms be added in the future that could influence the environmental effects observed?
That's a very good point. Yeah, no, we definitely have focused more on the monitoring, but if they are, it's possible that we're kind of adding a little bit of mitigation stuff. We haven't seen a lot of that yet in reports. that's something that I'll follow up on. I think that's actually a really good idea. And I would be on board with kind of lumping monitoring and mitigation activities. Basically, it's what are the monitoring, or what is the environmental activities that the developer is doing. I think that would be an interesting add. So yeah, thanks for the question. Great. Well, I believe that wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for spending your morning or evening with us, whatever time zone you are in. If you have a good day, and please do reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.